Three concepts have been presented to us in our readings for today: servanthood, suffering, and redemption. They are linked not only in the life of Jesus, but in our own lives as well. Today's first reading is part of the suffering servant passages from the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament. It speaks of how the sufferings of the servant of God leads to justification for the multitude and then ultimately glory for that servant. These passages identify the Messiah as the one who comes to redeem the people through his own suffering. Today's verses are the fourth of these passages in Isaiah. The suffering of the servant is part of God's plan. Through the suffering, the servant is able to bear the sins of the multitude and bring people into a closer relationship with the Father. Although there is pain involved in this process, God will enable the suffering servant to experience the fullness of life at the end. In our second reading from this morning, it's a similar image. I should say a familiar image, not a similar one, but a familiar image to the Jews of that time. It has the high priest entering the Holy of Holies in the temple and offering sacrifice as a sign of the people's repentance. The high priest was the only one who could enter into God's presence to beg for the pardoning of these sins. Jesus is the great high priest. Through his humanity, he identifies with us in all things except sin. He has experienced temptation, trials, pain, suffering, and yes, even death. As the Son of God, he also rose from the dead. He is now in the true Holy of Holies, heaven. And he can intercede for us with his Father. This allows grace, mercy, forgiveness, and love to be extended to us. Our gospel then comes at a pivotal time in the lives of the apostles. Jesus has finished his third forecast of his impending suffering and death. He is journeying now to Jerusalem. He will freely embrace his passion. His apostles are still in a fog about what his messiahship really means. They don't understand it fully yet. They assume that Jesus is going to establish an earthly realm. They will share power and hold positions of honor. James and John, the sons of thunder, asked Jesus for the number one and number two positions in this coming reign of his. Jesus describes his messiahship as not one of being served, but one of serving others through his ministry, his suffering, and his death. Suffering is a part of life. It can also be a way of being united with others and participating in the saving plan of God. God does not wish suffering on his people. He allows suffering to happen to remind us of his love for us. He allowed his Son to become human and experience all the aspects of human life: temptation, suffering, and death. Jesus accepted suffering to show us that God is with us. Jesus demonstrated divine love for us by coming as the Messiah, the suffering servant. Service of others involves giving of oneself. The ultimate act of service is by being willing to die for the sake of others. Think of firefighters. Think of police officers. Think of military men and women who have fought, suffered, and yes, died to maintain our way of living. Jesus did even more. He gave up his place at his Father's side, the position of the ultimate honor. He humbled himself by limiting himself to his human nature. He served people with his words. He ministered to their needs through his healing. He identified us through his temptations. And finally, he demonstrated his victory over sin and death by his resurrection and then his ascension into heaven. Thinking about what Jesus has done for us should open our eyes and motivate us to be his true disciples. It should give us encouragement when we suffer. Instead of expecting to be served and thinking of ourselves, we should think of others and see how we can bring them the experience of God serving them. Dying to self in service of others and in suffering. It is then that we most closely are united with our suffering servant, our Messiah.